So would you like to start by saying who you are and what your organisation is, and then perhaps you're going to make a statement first, or is Michelle coming in first?
What we're going to do, well, I'm going to speak first, and then Michelle's going to speak, and then hopefully there's the video that you're going to be able to play on your laptop. I think I arranged that with Donna, I think. That came through.
When did you send it?
Yesterday, I think, on the YouTube link on an email. That must have been to Donna, I think.
If you just check with Donna, we can perhaps play that afterwards while you're making the statement.
Yes, yep.
We can change it and we can use it with the probably on the machine actually.
Are you happy for me to start, or do you want to?
Absolutely.
You happy for me to start?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So my name is Kath Sansom, and I run Sling The Mesh campaign, and this is my colleague Michelle Moffatt, who helped me write our submission, our formal submission to the review team. So mesh has been called the thalidomide scandal of the 21st century. It is the same story of patients suffering from a treatment that was supposed to help, but instead has caused for some patients devastating harm, all because of a lack of quality evidence before it was mass launched, with all eyes instead on profits. In Sling The Mesh, we now have more than 7,100 members with shattered lives. 8 out of 10 of them suffer pain that affects their daily life. 7 out of 10 of them have lost their sex lives. More than half have ongoing urinary infections, and as a result of that, 1 in 12 are becoming antibiotic resistant. A third have had to give up work, and 1 in 5 have had to reduce their hours at work. 1 in 7 women's marriages have broken down. The devastation is huge, yet surgeon societies and regulators refuse to admit the scale of this and want to keep using mesh. I shall sum up why in 10 points. 1. For those affected by the thalidomide tragedy, their injuries were upsettingly obvious. For a woman injured by a mesh implant, her chronic pain, infection, reduced mobility, lost sex life and resulting depression and decimated quality of life is mostly invisible. It is easy to ignore or blame it on other health problems. 2. Traditionally, women's pain is downplayed by a patriarchal medical community who refuse to see how bad the mesh scandal is. Our survey found that 53% of women knew that mesh was causing their problems within just 6 months of having it implanted, but by comparison, just 8% of surgeons diagnosed their mesh complication. 3. Mesh was aggressively marketed. TVT, for example, soared from just 214 implanted in its first year in the UK in 1997 to nearly 12,000 by a decade later in 2008. By comparison, the Birch Culper suspension dropped from around 3,800 a year to 300 in the same time period. And if it hadn't been for the TVT, I believe that Birch would have become the gold standard via a laparoscopic approach. Some surgeons now don't know anything else other than mesh. Many have lost their traditional skills. No mesh equals no job. 4. Nobody wants to admit mesh was approved with flimsy evidence. Too much research was flawed by problems like industry funding, small numbers of women in trials, short-term follow-up. They're mainly focused on the fix and not the new problems caused in its wake. Or studies, for example, like one last month that came out in JAMA that report quoting a mesh removal risk at 3.3%. Other stuff that has gone wrong is in 1997, the TVT was destined to be a Category C under CERNIP, yet it was pushed to Category A despite concerns. Paperwork for this upgrade appears to have been lost when NICE took over from CERNIP in 2003. 5. The MHRA failed women and did not properly regulate mesh. In 2012, its York report missed out loss of sex life risk, which stands at 14.5%. This kept the overall risk percentage rate low at 1 to 3%. When I asked the MHRA press office why this had happened, they told me it was because loss of sex life or dyspareunia is not considered a general risk. In 2014, the MHRA issued a patient safety alert. They admitted they don't have enough resources to police device regulation. 6. Approval of medical devices is so weak, nobody checks what they're made of, how they're designed, or if clinical trials prove they're safe. Problems only come to light after huge media campaigns. 7. Hospital coding is a mess. There isn't even a HES code for ventral rectopexy mesh, never mind its removal. There is not a proper code for mesh eroding into organs or urethras. There is no code for partial snips of the mesh. A broad mesh complication code of PK 96.2 was created in June of this year, but surgeons do not seem to have been told about it, and to be honest, it's too late. 8. A study by Doug Tincello of Leicester showed that 8 out of 10 surgeons who were surveyed say they leave the old mesh behind if it fails and just put another one on top. 9. There were no patient-reported outcome measures. Nobody properly looked at the negative side effects of mesh, as reported by patients. 10. There is a black hole of missing data. Only a third of surgeons reported to the BSUG database. In 2012, BSUG adopted the internationally recognised 5-digit mesh complication coding system by the ICS and IUGA. This should have given us rich data on mesh problems and the time lag for them to cut in later, but no surgeons bothered to use those codes. In addition, the BSUG database shows that the TVTO has a risk of 2.3%, and the TVT has a higher risk of 2.8%. So by their own admission, the TVT is more risky, yet we are constantly being told it is the other way round. The fact is, nobody actually knows the true scale of this disaster. Every woman with a good outcome following a mesh operation is only okay for now. In Sling the Mesh, many women are fine for months or years before mesh causes problems. One woman had mesh slice her urethra after 18 years. So what are the solutions? We say incontinence and prolapse can be fixed using tried and tested methods without mesh. Mesh adds an additional layer of risk. In our group, 3/4 of our members have had incontinence mesh at 74%. 46% of those have had a TVT, and 26% have had the obturator mesh. Incontinence can be eased or fixed for 80% of women using physiotherapy. There are biofeedback gadgets or medication. If this doesn't work, there's native tissue slings, birch culpa suspension, or Kelly's plication. In our group, prolapse. 16% of our members have an abdominal pelvic organ prolapse, and 11% have vaginal pelvic organ prolapse mesh. So there's actually more having the abdominal pelvic mesh. For pelvic organ prolapse mesh, there was physio, rings and pessaries to try before going to surgery. For suturing, or for the right patient, the Manchester repair. For bowel complications, it is accepted that a rectal prolapse outside the body needs surgery, but this can be done using resection rectopexy with no mesh, the Delorme's technique, or suture rectopexy, all without mesh. Around 50% of the population have some kind of internal rectal prolapse, and surgery is not always needed, but again, suturing can be employed, or in cases of obstructed defecation, it can be eased with diet and lifestyle changes. I need to point out, biomesh is not the future. It is not strong enough, and 4% of our members are reporting debilitating pain and foreign body reaction. Composite mesh is not the answer either. This incorporates both polypropylene and biomesh. It is just double trouble. So what does Sling the Mesh want? We want a continued suspension until you can provide accurate long-term data on safety. If you do not uphold the suspension, then we want mesh to be pushed to the third and last resort option, only to be used when a non-mesh surgery has failed. We would like training programs so surgeons relearn non-mesh operations before these skills are lost forever. We desperately need accredited mesh removal training programs so that there's more surgeons able to remove mesh. And finally, we desperately in the UK need a Sunshine Payment Act, so any financial links to industry of a doctor or hospital can be checked to gauge if there is likely to be bias in any reports which they write.
Thank you very much. And no doubt you'll give us a copy of that, because I wasn't able to take down all the wonderful figures and facts and everything else. That'd be great. Michelle, would you like to just tell us your story?
Yeah, my name's Michelle Moffatt, and I've been heavily involved with Kath writing the submission for the independent review. I just want to follow on with three more major issues of concern. These are: 1, lack of informed consent; 2, risk of dyspareunia and loss of sex life being ignored; and 3, the need for a national registry and national recall. So looking at lack of informed consent and patient autonomy, what are the problems? Well, even today, mesh-injured women are being misinformed by some consultants who tell them their complications have nothing to do with the mesh. It's been blown out of proportion by the media, and it's all in their head. Only last week, a member of Sling The Mesh was told by her GP that a TV tape is not a mesh. Again last week, consultants recommended to 2 members of Sling The Mesh that a mesh device should be inserted from April 2019 once it becomes available again on the NHS. One of them is a 29-year-old mother who has not completed her family. She reported her surgeon spoke very highly of mesh, was not told of any risks, and that the negative comments on mesh were media hype. We know that women who are still to have children should not receive mesh. The other woman already has a mesh inserted and is suffering mesh complications, yet the surgeon recommends placing another mesh on top of the original. These are examples of failures of informed consent. The pelvic mesh scandal represents failure of all ethical principles. One of the most important is the issue of lack of informed consent. This is a substantial aspect of the pelvic mesh scandal in which 83% of women respondents in a Sling The Mesh survey in 2017 stated they were not given informed consent before surgery, despite the Montgomery ruling. The GMC guidelines on informed consent, published in 2008, are open to interpretation and we believe in bad need of revision. The draft NHS England specifications for management of SUI and POP and for the management of mesh complications, as well as similar guidelines drafted by NICE, are vague on informed consent, and they are vague on specific risks related to all pelvic mesh procedures, except to tell the patient that mesh is a permanent implant and difficult to remove. The purpose of RCOG's draft management aid is to provide patient information to assist women to make informed choices about choosing surgery for SUI. Yet the draft doesn't include the additional layer of risks caused by mesh, such as chronic pain, mesh erosion into other organs and vagina, or dyspareunia and loss of sex life. We question why. These omissions in the guidance allow room for pro-mesh surgeons to downplay or ignore risks. The estimates given in this draft guidance on risk on multiple mesh complications must be defined clearly with the specific scientific references. These omissions have led us to believe that the current estimates in this guidance have been selected to downplay risk. Without this full information, a surgeon cannot give true, fully informed consent. Leaving doctors to communicate risks without stating precisely what these are is likely to lead to history repeating itself. The EC Senate Committee issued their opinion on the safety of surgical meshes used in urogynecological surgery in December 2015, and I would like to just read what it states. Many patients are still undergoing mesh surgery as a first option without having all the necessary information regarding the potential risks. Unless worldwide standardization of guidelines and statistically accurate information identifying the potential risk in the use of these products is adopted, then true informed consent cannot and is not being obtained from the patient. So what are the solutions? In the absence of a continued suspension on mesh, there needs to be, at the very least, to be stricter controls including a review of the informed consent process for women being offered pelvic mesh. A much higher standard of informed consent is needed, with all potential risks explained. For example, add a section with Q&As. Can mesh damage sex life? Can it damage nerves? What might happen if my mesh needs to be removed? Can any surgeon perform a mesh removal? What are the removal waiting times? Patients should be given appropriate time to digest and research mesh benefits and risks. A standardized list of all risks of adverse events is needed, such as hemorrhage, mesh erosion resulting in organ perforation, nerve damage leading to disability, infection, chronic pain, dyspareunia and loss of sex life, and that these can occur any time after mesh insertion, often within 5 to 10 years. Currently, these risks are not explained sufficiently in any of the guidance being drafted by NHS England, NICE and RCOG. The same informed consent process applies to partial mesh removal. If NHS England can prove that simple, localised excision, their term for partial removal, is an appropriate pathway for women presenting with chronic pain, then they must ensure robustly fully informed consent processes in place, both verbally and in writing. NICE guidelines, the draft guidelines, state that there is a paucity of data on removals, so we don't know how they've been able to continue recommending the use of partial removals. We are absolutely against partial removals, as they do not address the multiple complications suffered by women. Partial removals prolong the suffering of women. They entail multiple surgeries and therefore raise the costs to the NHS. Comprehensive standardised patient information leaflets are missing, and we need to have them made available urgently. NHS England and NICE draft guidelines need to carefully review the guidance currently provided on informed consent and finalise only after the outcome of this review. It should be made clear in this guidance which patients should not have mesh. Women planning to have more children, diabetics, women who already have a pelvic mesh device, and so on. Statistically accurate information of potential risks needs to be made available for full and true informed consent to be obtained from the patient. Currently, this is not available. Mesh therefore needs to continue to be suspended, or at the very least only used in third-line last resort treatment until accurate risk statistics are known, as mentioned before by Kath. My second point is on dyspareunia and loss of sex life being ignored as a risk. What are the problems? The majority of women on Sling the Mesh were not told that dyspareunia was a mesh complication risk. Dyspareunia is defined as painful sexual intercourse, and in this context is caused by mesh eroding into and through the vaginal wall. In the NHS England draft specification, dyspareunia is not mentioned. Instead, the term sexual difficulty is used. In RCOG's draft management aid, the term sexual function deterioration is used. The medical term dyspareunia must be used. Dyspareunia includes excruciating pain that means a woman loses her sex life. In a Sling the Mesh survey in 2017, 7 out of 10 respondents reported suffering from dyspareunia and loss of sex life. Women whose mesh has eroded or is eroding through the vaginal wall are in chronic pain and at risk of infection. Their partners can also become injured. This loss of sex life puts huge strains on marital and partner relationships, including relationship and family breakdown. In the Sling the Mesh survey, already mentioned, 1 in 7 have reported suffering marriage breakdown, and 53% have had strains on their relationship as a result of dyspareunia. Dyspareunia leads to poor mental health, including anxiety and depression, of which 60% of respondents in our survey stated they had anxiety and depression. Dyspareunia alone affects women emotionally, physically, and economically when relationships break down. This is one risk that has been totally downplayed, totally ignored by medical institutions, surgeons, and in many of the scientific studies, which therefore keeps the complication rates low. Dyspareunia has been absent from RCT's all monitoring databases, including HES. This is a shocking omission. If suspension of mesh is lifted, what are the solutions? Ensure the definition of dyspareunia and its implications for loss of sex life are clearly stated in a standardised list of mesh risks and explained. NHS England draft service specifications and guidelines need to carefully review the terminology that they currently use. Ensure dyspareunia as a complication is captured in a mesh registry, a national recall, and all reporting mechanisms and RCTs. This will allow for the true figure of dyspareunia to be known. Currently, this is not available. My third and last issue is the need for a registry and a national recall. What are the problems? The number of mesh-injured women in the UK is unknown due to vast weaknesses in reporting and flawed research over the past 21 years. There is still uncertainty about the rate of complications in the long term due to lack of long-term data. There is a history of failures, particularly regulatory and adverse event reporting relating to the safety of pelvic mesh devices. So what are the solutions if the suspension of mesh is lifted? The establishment of an independent national pelvic mesh registry as a priority is needed to protect patients, improve outcomes, identify best practice, and reduce costs. Legislation must be put in place to mandate what must be measured in all patients with pelvic mesh implants, since voluntary entry of data has failed miserably, and to ensure reporting requirements are adhered to and complete information is maintained. A national recall to be conducted as a priority of all women who have received pelvic mesh devices. Only through a recall can the true statistics be found on outcomes. Patient-reported outcome measures, PROMs. A questionnaire needs to be developed for pelvic mesh insertion, partial removal and full removal. Independent studies can then link PROMs data with the National Mesh Registry and National Recall data. Correlations can then be found and between PROM scores and various surgical factors, patient factors and material factors, including implant brand. To summarise then, there is an urgent need for accurate statistics through a national registry and a national recall and PROMs to enable true informed consent that includes accurate statistics on mesh risks that have been missing to date. For example, erosion into vagina and other organs, chronic pain and dyspareunia. Ultimately, we want a continued suspension of mesh until long-term accurate data on risks, on safety is obtained. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you so much. Both your presentations have been very forceful, and thank you for that. Can I, first of all, Michelle, ask you a question, and then I'd like to ask Kath also a question. I absolutely understand what you're saying about consent, and we've heard it from a lot of different patients through the course of this review. When you go and visit a surgeon and you have a problem, and you're suggesting, of course, that not always the full facts are given to the woman. The woman and the surgeon are very often just together in a room, together, a consulting room or whatever. How can you ensure that the woman is actually given the full facts, figures, everything that's needed for proper consent? Is there other tools that you think would be helpful, both to the surgeon and also to the woman?
I think the only way is for the conversation to be recorded, and that there's a copy for the patient and for the doctor. Because there is a lot of denial, going on, and we can't trust all doctors with the truth. So it has to be recorded, and the process needs to be made. The controls need to be stricter. So there needs to be a more prescriptive consent process with, as I mentioned before, the standardised list of complications and the explanation of those complications, so that the patient has the full information, and is able to go away and digest that information before she decides which option is best for her.
So are you saying it should be recorded?
Yes.
Are you suggesting it should be a video recording, or should it just be written, or what's the recording?
I think both. But ideally, but that's an ideal situation. So an audio recording is obviously something that the patient can have as well as the doctor.
I think the audio was, I've seen it done, and has been successful, because you can take it away and then think about it. But that's helpful. But do you think there should be some sort of a checklist for the surgeon covering these different
Yes,
areas?
I think that
you want a paper record?
I think there should be, yes, the informed consent process should be a written process with a checklist of all the risks and the definition, the explanation, and that's also given to the patient so that it's completely transparent.
And signed by both?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, thank you. Now, I've just been given a message that your video is ready to play. So before I ask you, would that be helpful to you if we played the video now?
Yes. Can I just make a point on informed consent?
Yes.
It's Mike, and I know we're going to be doing some work tomorrow with HKIP and looking at apps and patient leaflets, standardised leaflets, listing all the risks and listing what can go wrong. My concern, even with every check that you try and put in place in the hands of a pro-mesh surgeon, they are still going to downplay those risks to a woman. They might not describe the word dyspareunia properly. They might just say it's I didn't know what the word dyspareunia was until I did this campaign. Things might not be described properly. They might downplay it as short term. Don't worry, you'll get over it very quickly. It is my concern that with every best will in the world, even with all these checks in place, I am not convinced that every single surgeon in the UK will give a woman a properly informed consent, because you cannot, even with recordings are maybe a way forward, but you can't be in every single consulting room in every single hospital in the country. It's a real concern to me.
But of course the numbers of these insertions has been going down.
Yeah, but that's only because of the campaign and the media campaign and women becoming aware of the complications. I really want mesh to be pushed to the third and final option. I know in the nice draft it's still second option. I think it should be third and final option, and that's the only way you're going to get a proper consent from women, because they will know then how risky it is for it to be a third and final option.
Right, so did you want to ask something?
You mentioned JAMA. I used to be on the editorial board of JAMA years ago.
Ah, okay.
We formulated the notion then that it's the patient is the pilot and the doctor is the navigator. In other words, you need to do it together. And it occurs to me that maybe these guidelines ought to be approved by the patient group and the professional group working together. You talk about the ARCOG guidelines. Well, shouldn't guidelines perhaps be approved?
Are we talking nice draft guidelines here?
No, whatever guidelines are for anything.
Right, okay, yes, they should.
Patients and profession approve them together.
Yes, indeed, but often historically patients haven't been invited onto these things.
No.
So although, for example, I'm a stakeholder for the nice drafts, but that's very different to being invited onto the committee and having an input, and that hasn't happened.
Right, okay, thank you. Simon.
Well, I was going to make a similar point, and I think you've answered that already. But in terms of the concern about conformity amongst surgeons,
yes.
To what extent would it help? This assumes that pelvic mesh operations continue. That's this part of the conversation is based on that assumption, which may or may not be the case. But if it were to be the case, then if you've got accredited centres for insertion, not just for removal, does that, in your eyes, does that reduce the risk of non-conformity or inconsistency in consent?
It would help reduce risk, but it wouldn't eliminate it, because you're still going to get pro-mesh surgeons within accredited centres, in my opinion. But it does reduce the risk, because it's then not carte blanche in every district hospital across the country.
So you'd support accredited centres for insertion, not just for removal?
Yeah. But I'm still really keen to get across the message that mesh needs to be the third and final last chance saloon and not the second option, because that's what has happened. That's what the situation has been for 21 years. It's been second option. It needs to be third and final option.
Shall we see this video?
Yes.
I'm not sure how we do that.
Bring it over here.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
A very powerful video. Can I ask you, Kath, about your comments about the MHRA's response to the particular issue we're discussing, pelvic mesh, and also in your evidence to us, you say that it highlights the concerns, particularly because it's close to industry and potential conflicts of interest. Could you talk a little more about conflicts of interest?
With the MHRA?
Yes.
I suppose it concerns us that people who work for the MHRA have been recruited from previously working inside industry. It concerns us that there is funding in part from industry for the organisation. It concerns us, the York report concerned us greatly from 2012 that the evidence was there for dyspareunia, for example, and they just decided not to include that risk, in my opinion, to keep the risk figures low. It concerns me that they're not fit for the job that they've been set up to perform. It concerns me, in 2012 they held a meeting with on medical device safety. I didn't bring my notes in, but it wasn't really addressing the issue. It was saying they couldn't pull things off the market unless they weren't performing properly. I just don't think that they have regulated or properly logged adverse events. They haven't publicised their yellow card system, for example. Another problem is that surgeons cannot log an adverse event from another surgeon's work. For example, if I've had a mesh implanted at hospital A, but I've gone to hospital B for my removal, but hospital B surgeon cannot report my adverse event because it's the work of surgeon A without getting his approval, and that's helped keep adverse event reporting low. That's a big problem as well. Does that help?
We clearly need a regulator.
Yes.
So thinking about the MHRA, what are your suggestions for better regulation?
They need to be independent from industry. Have you got some suggestions, Michelle?
No, I mean, well, of course, based on the grandfather product, the whole, the regulation is lax. So the current regulation needs to be vastly tightened up so that you can't just have one agreed based on the evidence of the original product. It needs to be tightened up so that there's a lot more processes to go through. At the moment there are no trials at all, are there, for the majority of products? We are the guinea pigs. We were the guinea pigs, the ones that had these. But that has to stop. We're not against innovation, but we would like to see some much stricter controls on these devices.
And I think every medical device that is launched on the market needs some kind of database.
Sorry, every
medical device that is now launched needs some kind of registry to track it, because there's so many new products coming on the market. Derek Alderson has said that this week, President of the Royal College of Surgeons. There's so many new products coming on the market, and the problems only come to light when you get patient campaigns like this one.
Are you also suggesting that the standard equivalence process should be altered?
Yes, definitely.
That needs to be looked at. You can't just approve a product because it's equivalent to something that was equivalent to something else that was equivalent to something else that actually dates back to 1996 that isn't even on the market anymore. There needs to be a tightening up of approval processes.
All right. And then finally from me, can I just ask you, do you think there are circumstances in which you would really support mesh? You've talked about it as being the last resort. So presumably you might want another pause in terms of its use when there's more research done. My concern is that we really are trying to get through this review at some speed, very thorough, but some speed, because we're very conscious of the people who are suffering now. So I'm just wondering.
I'm aware there's a vast body of women like me who are rushed for a mesh when mine would have fixed with physiotherapy. So there are some women, for example, who do need to try the birch cobble suspension or the autologous sling route. And if that fails, and then they want a mesh because they're desperate for fix and they're fully consented and they properly know all the risks, then as a third and final option. But only as third and final option, because for women with a mild incontinence, and we have a vast amount of those in the page, who didn't even really need surgery. That's the women you've got to stop being rushed through to surgery. I mean, the figures, let me just check it here so I'm giving you the proper figures. I mean, it just shows you that back in the year 2000, there was just around about 3,800 birch were being performed for incontinence. But when TVT was at its peak, there were nearly 12,000. Well, you haven't suddenly got a nation of more women wetting their pants. You've suddenly got a nation of women who have been encouraged into operation that they probably didn't need in the first place. So what I'm saying is...
When pelvic physio would have been all they needed. But that service is not actually automatically offered.
No.
That's the problem.
So that service needs to be strengthened up for the physiotherapy option, and then if that doesn't work, then you've got your non-mesh surgeries, and then if that doesn't work and the woman is consented, then mesh. That's what I'm saying about the third and final option.
Simon, I think, wanted
No,
to
Valerie,
ask.
I
Oh,
think.
Valerie.
I do, and following up directly on that point, because one of the things you said earlier was that there are clearly a group of women who should never be offered
Yes.
mesh. But I'm wondering, and this is what slightly worries me about what you were saying, the second and third option, mesh should be the third option. Is there potentially, and maybe we just don't know, maybe the registry, if we have one, will deliver what we deem to know, a group of women for whom actually it's better indicated for them. And the worry about going through the second and third process is that by giving them an operation which potentially could leave them scarred, make it more difficult for the mesh that they might subsequently have to work for them. Now, I don't know the answer to this, but as I say, it's just something that we need to think about, that as easily as you can say there are women for whom we should never offer mesh, maybe there's some who actually might benefit from it if we can begin to find those women, and for whom giving them a second operation when the failed conservative treatment doesn't work, it's not working, maybe we need to be able to think about that, and I don't know the answer.
Okay, so my concern here is we're talking about finding the correct patient. And in my opinion, there is no such thing as a correct patient, simply because, as I'm sure you'll be hearing from the review, it is a rush and roulette risk. You can't line me up a group of women and say, you probably won't suffer because of X, Y, and Z. You can't actually tell, and within the page, you wouldn't be able to line up women and know who's going to suffer and who's not. So in my opinion, there isn't a correctly selected patient. You'd be better to ask Susie O'Neill in that opinion, because she will obviously know better than me, but my opinion is that there is not the correctly selected patient. You can't tell who's...
Can I just ask one more question, Julia? I know that when you've been talking about adverse event reporting, the yellow card, you have mentioned the MAUD system that operates in the States. I just wondered whether you could say, particularly, what is it about that system that you think is really worth following through?
Okay, the thing I like about MAUD is that it's an open database, so any patient can go on and check it. So for example, if I go on as a patient, think, right, I've been offered whatever it is, TVT, and then you type it in, and anyone who's had a problem with that TVT, or type in Gynaecare or that brand, you can actually look up what the problem is. So MAUD is open to scrutiny, whereas the MHRA database or the yellow card isn't.
So it is that?
Yes.
The openness and transparency?
Yes, the transparency, yes.
And in terms of sort of, one of the things we're looking at is not just sort of the retrospective, but going forward as well. Is there anything you could think of that would act as preventative measures before we start? So, I mean, thinking more pelvic floor education, things like that. Is there anything positive that we could do in that direction?
Oh, definitely. So a better education programme among teenage girls in schools, so start that as part of the school education programme. That's okay to discuss pelvic floor. It's part of your body, it's part of your health. I'm particularly concerned because there is a rise in young girls doing long distance running and high impact training, so I do think there's more impact on young girls' pelvic floors. I think after babies there needs to be, instead of the 6-week GP checkup, I think there is a programme, there's a group called Pelvic Raw, and they would like that 6-week checkup to be replaced by a pelvic floor specialist with additional training in things like mental health, breastfeeding, so you've got whole care of the woman. And at that very early stage you'll be learning the importance of your pelvic floor, taking care of them. I think you're probably aware in France you're offered a standard physiotherapy. So I think that we need to bring it right back to the basics of when a woman's first had a baby, to look after your pelvic floor for life.
Perhaps actually before she has the baby.
Well, yeah, indeed, yes.
Right, okay. So,
Yes, please. Kath, you said that TVT was actually had more complications than TVTO. That slightly surprised me.
Yes.
Because I have understood that the complications of the obturator fossa tape are actually quite considerably more difficult to cope with than the TVT.
They are. Well, it surprised me. This is in the BSUGS report. It's called The Stress Urinary Incontinence in the UK 2008 to 2017. So it's BSUG's own data that they brought a report out. It's either last month or the month before. And you'll find it on page 19 and page 24. But that's their own figures. It actually shows that TVT has actually got a higher risk than TVTO. And it surprised me too, because we've all worked on the basis that the TVTO, which is the type you had, isn't it? It carries more risk through going through the obturator. And certainly, and Susie will speak more, it's a more difficult mesh to remove. But it just, you're like, well, where are we?
That is, I think, the point. It's more difficult to remove. In terms of putting it in, I understand it's less risky than the TUT.
Well, the injuries to the obturator nerve are more risky, I would say.
Yeah,
and in removing it also, going through that area
is so difficult to get out.
So it surprised me also to see those figures.
Yeah. The other thing is about NICE guidelines, the new NICE guidelines. You presumably will be responding to those.
Yes. Well, I have already. I read all 3,000 pages. It's a lovely evening I spent doing that. Are we able to see
your response, or is that?
It will be published on. Would you like me to email to you what I sent to them? I don't know. Would that be helpful?
That'd be very helpful. Yes.
Okay.
And the final thing was the national recall. Can you explain how that could actually take place? Would you be using HES data to identify the women? Because on the registries, the women aren't identified.
That's an issue because of the vast underreporting on the HES.
And you wouldn't pick up the private patients.
I'm absolutely with you about the national database, but it doesn't exist at the moment. The registers that do exist are only partial, and they do not identify the women. So the only way I can see of actually identifying, and I don't even know that's possible, is using HES data, and we know what the problem is there. But I wonder if you've given any...
The only thought I'd had is from a surgeon who I know won't want to be named, but said the only way you're going to be able to do it is to write to every single woman that's had a mesh operation.
The question, how do you find them?
Well, indeed. That's a real trawl, isn't it? So we're stuck in this position whereby that's a trawl, it's very expensive, but that's actually, in reality, the only way you're going to find out the true figure of risk, because everyone's playing around with figures and no one actually really knows.
And actually, it would take a lot of time to achieve it.
Indeed.
And some women don't know they've had mesh insertion.
No, indeed. So we're stuck in this awful position of 21 years without a database of not really knowing the true risk, but all of us knowing it's a lot higher than JAMA telling us 3.3% mesh removal, because it's not all about mesh removal risk anyway. We're just stuck in a horrible position of not known figures.
Yes, Simon.
I'm sure we will carry on the dialogue after today, because there's plenty of other things we'd like to talk about. But can I just go back to the full versus partial removal point, that your concerns about partial removal? Have you, from your members, got any information or data about how many full removals actually end up as partial removals?
Sorry. Oh, how many?
So a woman goes to a surgeon for a full removal, but the surgeon is unable to complete the full removal. Do we have any, from your membership, is there any information about how many women have been through that process of having to do a second full removal operation for silver?
Only anecdotal, but if you want that information, it would be so easy to set up a poll. I can do that. The women respond very well. We usually get about 600 to 700 respond in a poll, but I haven't got that information. It's all anecdotal.
I think it would be quite interesting.
Yeah, I think it should be done, to be fair, because then at least you get an idea of where women are at. Because for NICE guidelines to suggest that partials are okay based on a paucity, that's their word, or very low evidence, is not good enough to be able to set up a guideline on let's just snip women's mesh, because we know from patient voice that that's not good enough. So I can set up a survey, because at least we'll have some data then.
And also, if NHS England actually spoke directly with the mesh removal surgeons, the handful, we only have a handful in the country, actually, because they are full-time removing at the moment. They've got a backlog, and they're the ones that can tell them about, the partial removals. And I know one surgeon, he's against partial removals because it's much more difficult for them to do the full removal later, because a partial removal will not sort out the problem. The woman will present again, and the only option is to remove the whole thing. So they're not actually going directly to those surgeons. We know that they're not contacting them as part of the engagement process, which is a bit alarming.
I have to say you've been very comprehensive, and thank you very much. But if there are other things you think we should be examining, thinking about, we've had your evidence that you wrote in, and that was very helpful. We've had the session today. And if we have questions, perhaps we could come back to you as well. But can I thank you both very, very much indeed for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.